Lennina Ofori, founder CEO of the Awareness Tap and Principal Housing.
Yeah.
You're going to talk to us about the politics of participation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, lovely people. How are you? I'm going to say evening. It's Thursday evening, which is like a new Friday. So, yes. So, where to begin? The politics of participation. I think our lovely doctor here actually said a couple of things that I always touch on as well. I think there's going to be nuance because of the work that we do. So a bit about myself first. My name is Lennina Ofori. I am a CEO of a supported accommodation company I've been running for 7 years. I'm also the founder of a film and social action research company called the Awareness Tap, which stands for the Awareness Through Arts Programs or Through Arts Projects. And the point of it is that it's a tap because it keeps on running, because there's always something to be making people aware about. And I'm an independent consultant around systems change, and I use storytelling as a methodology for systems change. And that is why this work is so important to me, because actually, is it supposed to be community-led or funder-led? And obviously, I'm going to say it should be community-led. And I will touch on a couple of case studies, but mainly the first thing is I'll put it out to you guys. Actually, what I'd like to do to make it a bit interactive, it's the evening as well, the people time. What does community mean to you? Because you know what funders do, but what do communities do? So does anyone want to answer what communities do, or what you think a community is? Don't be shy, guys. Come on. Anyone?
People who have relationship with each other.
People have relationships with each other. Yeah.
Work towards.
Yeah. Common goals, exactly. Anybody else? One more? Yeah.
I'm going to say consistency.
Consistency. I love that.
Authorities and funders change over time.
Perfect.
Communities are always
Perfect. And the reason why I asked is because when all we're speaking, I think we've probably all got the same kind of focus. To me, community is so important. So as obviously I'm a black woman sitting here, and I want to talk about firstly, when we're getting information from communities, the fact of the authenticity of them, the communities, and the difference between what the communities are saying and how it's translated by the funders. And that's a big thing to me, because my whole doctorate is around storytelling for systems change, and how are we hearing the story of the communities to shift the system, opposed to a lot of the work that we get to read in reports, which are green papers and white papers and all the rest of it. It isn't written in Ebonics or in the certain communities they go in to get the information from. And I always felt that when I was even dealing with funders or speaking to funders, that actually there's a common goal that they may have. They may have an aim, and then there are certain organisations that seem to tick that off. And something that you said as well about the fact that the work is very deep, the work is very powerful, the work is very emotional to make change in any community. Any group that needs funding is serving a need. However, the funders actually also have their own kind of aims and objectives, and the feelings that we maybe as researchers feel, or the facilitators, or the youth workers, or the people on the ground feel is very different to what the funders will be feeling. So this is why I've always felt like there's politics there. The communities are often extracted from, and not all funders are doing it intentionally. It's just the system that we're moving around and moving within. But if the community is able to have a voice and tell their story and to lead and to kind of dictate where the funding goes to, obviously the needs will be actually better met. However, it's usually the other way around. There's a funding pot, and the funding pot is to maybe, for example, tackle knife crime, and then potentially an organisation that has the resources to fill those forms out, because let's face it, most people and organisations who do great grassroots work don't have the budget for a bid writer. That's another funding pot that they have to go to get the bid writer in. So they may be really apt at doing the work, however, they're not apt at getting the bid. And a lot of organisations that are great at writing bids often take the lower hanging fruit when it comes to the issues in black and brown communities and also marginalised communities. So for example, I'll give a good case study. For example, the Youth Endowment Fund, they were They had a neighbourhood programme, and I was a lead researcher like in community engagement, and I worked alongside social finance, which is social impact ones as well. And what I loved about that funding was that when I went out to do the research, I was able to tell the communities that once we've done this research and the discovery phase, we have £1 million to give into the community that we're working with. So as a researcher, going into this community, I wasn't feeling like, oh, I'm talking to all these people. I was building beautiful relationships over 18 months. And then at the end, we've got this great report that makes the fund look great. And everybody might tap me on the back as a consultant, I've done this work. However, what happens to them? But the beauty was that the money was catalysed after we done the work. And they were able to have governance over that. And we were able to build a theory of change just from the storytelling, which people would think sounds crazy. But actually, my thing is qualitative research. I know we need quantitative research. I'm doing a PhD, so we definitely need quantitative research. But the qualitative, in layman's terms, is story. It's dialect, it's conversation, it's what you said, like the communities have got they've got a common goal. But often they have nuance, but they have a common voice. Because they're faced with the same burdens, they're faced with the same issues, the same needs, and it may be different, black, brown, white people, all in the same community. They still may have the same fear for their children. They may still realise that the rubbish isn't picked up around the same time, and race doesn't even come into it at that point. Actually, it's actually a demographic, it's the area, the postcode, or whatever else. And I felt the power of that funding was when you're going somewhere and you're asking lots of questions, doing really great work, you go home as a researcher, people don't believe it or not. I'm a consultant, but I prefer just researcher because consultant makes it seem very pretentious and it separates me from the community sometimes. But when you go in and do that work, and even if you've got a strategic hat on, and then you've got I'm a human, I'm a mother, so I'm a wife, I'm someone's sister, someone's daughter. So when I'm going in and seeing need, I feel that, and I build these relationships. And when there's not that next step for step change, whereas we could say, oh, £1 million is coming to the community, what happens is you take that and you hold that load. And I think a lot of funders don't think about that part. I heard you, that was like towards the end of your talk, was speaking about that. There's a massive, big gap of work that needs to be done when we get money, because it's built basically 6 months, 12 months, 3 years. And actually needs go on so much longer than that, it's so much more vast. And that's where the community has the ability to talk about longitudinal work. We heard like words like longevity and longitudinal work. You think like academic or university, but what I just mean by that is that for something to have a long lifespan, community is forever. So whether you live here for 3 years and you move out, you may leave your cousin here, your brother here, whatever else. You want whatever's happening in that community to continue, to develop, to grow, to be nurtured. And if the funding pot is like 6 months, 12 months, great work happens, 12 young beneficiaries, it looks great on the report and everybody's happy for that moment, but actually the young people, the communities don't actually feel the tangible impact. It's just like this little droplet. And I think that's why I always believe that it's very political. The community's voice, which is qualitative research, is what should be shaping funding. And I'm finding that it's quite hard. I understand when you're going, I remember when I ran an organisation that was going for funding all the time. And obviously, to keep the lights on, to keep people paid and projects going, you will go for certain funding. And if it's kind of like slightly what you do, you're kind of, oh, I can do that, yeah. But actually, it's not what you want to do. And that's because the funding is being designed from people who don't actually understand the communities that the money serves. So if the community is actually able to give their story, the qualitative research, I feel that they're able to dictate to you what the need is. And I don't know how many people in here have community groups. Is there anyone in here who runs a community group or is working for a community group? Yeah. And I think that the dichotomy that I think I found is that funders, community groups need to have good relationships with funders. That's the thing. Everybody here knows that. And funders also want to know more about community groups. The politics comes in is the fact that not enough funders get stuck into the work that's happening on the ground. And I feel like something I say is a recommendation to funders, but also to groups that are going for funding is it's not a them and us thing. I think the pretense and the element of fear of like needing them to vie and like be close to you and understand your work and for you to get favour from them is a pressure that no community group needs but has. So, for example, you're not always going to challenge the funders because you need the money and you want them to like you and think you're nice. And all these emotions that we don't actually talk about openly because people don't bring the whole selves into work. But this is the reality of getting funding. If you've got a funder that wants to give you funding, you want them to favour you. You want them to like you. But actually, there is room for challenge. And that is how funders will understand because it is political. What I would say about the participation piece is this. I've worked with a lot of organisations, and I'll go back to another case study in Haringey, where I'm originally from Tottenham, so when I had the opportunity, North London, when I really had the opportunity to have autonomy and choose an area via children needs programme around youth violence, I chose Tottenham because that's where I was born and raised, and I just felt like it's altruistic and why wouldn't I go back to where I came from. But what I found was that I was back in the place where I was raised and I also had my own traumas, and I had seen that as much as like the gentrification had really like given it a nice touch-up job, the issues were still very much the same. And when the funding ended, I was left with this feeling of an onus to stay, which I did. I stayed working with them until they actually got the funding again. But I think that's a pressure that shouldn't be on anybody doing work with communities. It should be back to the funder. The participation piece and the integrity around the participation is the fact that these people who give data to funders are human beings who have lived experience and have traumas. And those traumas and that storytelling is actually what builds the next pot of funding for another organisation who may even be less deserving than the one who gave the research in the beginning. And I think that part about being a participant of anything, I'd say one, if you are part of research for any funding group or part of a programme and you've been funded and you're doing research, find out what the exit strategy is. Because I think there's lots of promises from a lot of people when projects are starting, but the follow through is quite hard. Not because people are being disingenuous always, sometimes maybe, but not always. Sometimes it's because there's so much red tape when it comes to different funding that actually things change, like the rules change. You could be doing an 18-month project, 12 months down the road, government has changed something, so then that means that the funding that you're supposed to get doesn't come in. So it's about having concrete exit strategies when you're building programs where you're allowing people who namely are vulnerable a lot of the time or have lived experience. They are telling their stories, they're giving qualitative data, they're helping to build a future for their community that they may not even get to see themselves. What are they getting from it? And what is the kind of reciprocation is something that I would say that everybody should be thinking about when they're going for funding. I feel like I know that I'm biased already, that I think it should be community-led, but the rationale behind how much community-led it should be is like a big thing I think could be up for debate even today, because actually some communities won't have the resources to understand the governance piece around it, and I understand that, but I also feel like when people are being funded, or even if you're an organisation or you're in leadership and you're thinking and strategizing, it's about how we're using funding that we get to upskill our people, how are we upskilling them to be able to be sustainable beyond the funder. And that funding was never meant to be a continuum. In my eyes, I see funding as like a bit of a lifeline, and then I believe that it should be used to build up organisations, and for organisations to be looking at their skill sets where there's a gap and to be upskilling, because what ends up happening is that it's that kind of, I don't remember the saying, but when someone teaches you to fish, because most people are just like, they're not teaching the communities to fish, they're literally just helping them and then leaving, and then there's a need and there's a need and there's a need. And my thing is, if they're participating in big pieces of research or getting involved in shaping funding, because that's what every program that happens in communities shapes another pot of funding. And I've seen it, and it's quite painful if the group is not going to be eligible for the next pot because they had the other pot. So now the people who are worked with next get better treatment, better outcomes, better impact, and it's off the back of somebody else or another group. So it's really important for us to look at the integrity around the funding. And for funders, if there's any funders in the room, is there any funders in the room? I wonder, yes. When you're building funding pots, to be thinking about the people on a deeper layer. So like I know that when I work with funders, we're looking at youth violence and we're looking at the percentages. But when you hear the qualitative research, you hear the data, you hear the people speaking about what it felt like to lose a child through knife crime or what they felt like to be stabbed, etc. It's so much more emotive when you're on the ground with them, and it makes you know that actually these people can't tell their stories just for telling their story's sake. It has to be for a reason. There has to be real change that happens around that. And I think it's a political piece because at the end of the day, we're dealing with human beings and we're dealing with a lot of power. And I believe in like sharing power with organisations who are working in marginalised groups, organisations who are working with vulnerable people need that power. They need that power back. And they don't have that power if the decisions are being made for them. And also when it comes to report writing actually is a big thing for a lot of organisations to take part in. And I feel like when I watch a lot of people writing their reports to feedback to funders, they don't know how to develop an evidence base for the work that they do. Youth workers don't know how to actually evidence the fact that a young person came in crying and they were going to retaliate in a knife crime. But because I sat down and spoke to them and actually like kind of spoke to them about the outcome of what would happen and how detrimental it would be, they did not end up stabbing somebody. And it's really hard to measure things that are like that. And I think there's a piece around the community groups educating the funders, and I haven't seen enough of that. And I think that if we're getting community groups to participate, or we're having young people participating in research, etc., we have to give them power, and we have to share power with groups, opposed to funders giving money for them to do work. It's actually about us growing their work in a place, from a place of integrity.
That's fantastic. Thank